Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Today's Social Work Podcast, The Training and Education of Military Social Workers, is the first of a two-part series. Part 2 is a discussion of cultural considerations in military social work. And I'm doing this two-part series because whether you agree or disagree with America's involvement in what's now become the longest continuous combat engagement in its 235-year history, there's an urgent need to understand and engage with the military service members, veterans, their families, and their communities in effective social work practice. Now, I realize that most of you don't think of yourselves as military social workers. I'm reading your thoughts. You're thinking, I don't work for the VA. That's Veterans Administration. I'm not contracted by the military. I don't wear the uniform and serve in the armed forces. And that's true. And yet, according to my guest, Anthony Hassan, you could still be a military social worker.
In a nutshell, it's basically anyone who works with a service member, a veteran, or their family member.
According to a 2011 RAND report, quote, since October 2001, approximately 2 million U.S. troops have deployed as part of Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. Most of these previously deployed individuals have since left the military or retired, and most previously deployed National Guard and reservists have returned to their home communities. And all of these folks are now considered community-dwelling veterans. And these community-dwelling veterans seek services where they live, in their communities. So for all of you who work in communities, and yes, that's everyone, chances are you're providing services to veterans and their families. And that's the main focus of today's military social work. And yet, most of us, unless we work directly with the military, have no idea what might be required for effective practice with this population. By all accounts, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have exacted a significant toll on community-dwelling veterans and their families. In response to this need, in 2010, the Council on Social Work Education published guidelines for educational competencies for advanced social work practice in military social work. The authors of these guidelines explained, quote, with no end in sight and the ultimate results of these wars uncertain, we are now challenged with both a military that's exhibiting the stress-related consequences of these long and multiple combat deployments and a rapidly growing veteran population in need of a wide range of combat-related physical and mental health care services. Every community in the United States has been affected, and service delivery systems are trying to respond. Military social work, as a field of practice and research, is critical to our relevance as social workers to the advancement of new career options and in our leadership among the helping professionals. This does not mean that we endorse war or aggression, but rather that we extend meaningful help to those who have been affected. This is a moment in history when we can reassert our central influence as a pivotal healing profession in the midst of wartime and in the aftermath by promoting a vigorous social work research agenda and appropriate training to effectively prepare military social workers. That's some serious stuff. In order to better understand both the training and education of military social workers, I spoke with a man who's on the forefront of the current reconceptualization of military social work. My guest, Anthony Hassan, is a retired Air Force officer with 25 years of experience in military social work. He served during Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2004 on the first ever Air Force Combat Stress Control and Prevention Team embedded with an Army unit. He led the largest military substance abuse and family advocacy programs in the Pacific, which were recognized as benchmark programs and training sites for all other Pacific bases. And that bit from the CSWE guidelines that I just read? Well, Anthony is the chair of the committee responsible for creating those. And if those bona fides aren't enough, he's currently the director of the Center for Innovation and Research on Veterans and Military Families at the University of Southern California's School of Social Work. In today's social work podcast, Anthony and I talked about how the definition of military social work has changed over time, how educators and practitioners can use the CSWE guidelines, and what some of the opportunities are for advanced training at the master's and doctoral level, as well as at the certificate level in military social work at USC's School of Social Work. We talked about how that program uses a virtual patient as part of the training. And we talked about the central role that the profession of social work could and should play addressing the issues faced by active duty military, community-dwelling veterans, and their families. We talked about the kinds of jobs that military social workers do and ended our conversation with some resources for listeners wanting to know more. A couple of notes about this interview. Anthony and I spoke for about an hour and a half, and our conversation about the education and training actually happened in the second half of our interview. And because I'm presenting it as part one, there are a couple of times when he makes references to information that we discussed in the beginning of the conversation, which is now part two. And I hope that's not too confusing. Another thing that stands out about this interview is that for the first time, I invited listeners of the Social Work Podcast who are fans on Facebook to submit questions for Anthony. And the response was fantastic. There were over 20 questions, most of which I couldn't even get to. But those that were suggested on Facebook were wonderful, and I identify them as such in the interview. So, thank you to everyone who posted questions. You'll recognize your contribution to this interview. And I'll definitely be asking folks to submit questions for future podcasts. Finally, as with all my remote interviews, this one was done using Skype. Anthony was in Los Angeles, and I was 3,000 miles away in Philadelphia. And now, without further ado, on to episode 68 of the Social Work Podcast, the training and education of military social workers, an interview with Dr. Anthony Hassan. So let's talk about this for a minute. Let's talk about the training that you think that social workers should get in order to work best with these community-dwelling veterans. And we can talk specifically about the CSWE guidelines for advanced military social work practice that you chaired. We can talk about the program at USC. One of the questions off Facebook was, what does the academic training of military social workers look like? Do schools of social work with military social work concentrations provide extra training on specific topics? And specifically, does USC's concentration in military social work differ from other schools of social work that have concentrations in military social work?
Great questions, and I'll probably answer them in a roundabout way. I know one of the questions was, well, what is a military social worker? And we, the CSWE steering committee that I chaired, we had to figure that out. We had to define what is military social work. Is military social work just those who wear the uniform and who serve in the armed forces? What about, folks in Homeland Security and public health? Are they military social workers? Or what about the civilian social worker who works outside the military base? Are they a military? So what is it? And I think in a nutshell, it's basically anyone who works with a service member, a veteran, or their family member would be a military social worker. So if the practice of social work is what you're doing, and you're primarily seeing veterans and service members and their families, then we would call that military social work. And we've tried to define the competencies, the advanced practice behaviors and knowledge that you need to do this work, and they're clearly spelled out in the CSWE guidebook. But that was something we had to wrestle with. As a military person, my first thought was, I don't like that, because I've always thought of military social workers being those who wore the uniform, or who are wearing the uniform and doing social work in the military. But that's too narrow, and that's why we said we want to be more inclusive rather than exclusive. And we basically have said, if you're working with veteran service members or their families, and the primary focus of your work is to advocate for them, broker for them, provide clinical services, navigate systems for them, then we would call you military social work.
Do you think that's a definition that is different now than it would have been in, say, 1995? Is part of your discomfort in part because you you went through the military. You're a veteran, and you retired from the military, and times have changed. Is that part of it?
Absolutely. I think times have changed. And I think, back in 95, I probably would have only identified military social work as someone who wore the uniform in the Department of Defense and who was a social worker in the service. But I quickly realized now that the need is greater, and the most need is not in the service, it's outside of the service. And I think for social work, it's time for us to step up. It's time for us to embrace this population and recognize their needs. We shouldn't lose this moment in time. We really need to capture it in a way that says, we need to have a profession called military social work, because there are many people who are doing this, but also whenever you have an identified profession or a specialty, you have to have competencies. And so once we developed the competencies, it was very clear to us that there are specific knowledge and skills that you will need if you're going to do this. And so those who have that, those are the ones that we want to call military social work.
So now there are these competencies. Do social work training programs with specializations in military social work follow this model?
Well, that was the whole hope and wish, and that's what we want. We being CSWE, we being the steering committee and the task force, all felt that if you were going to establish a course, a sub-concentration or a concentration, a specialty, whatever you want to call it, within your school of social work, you really needed to have a clear understanding of what it is that you were training to. What are the outcomes? What would be the walk-away competencies that you'd expect this student to have if you're going to have a course? So this was a guidebook to really help someone write a course, write a concentration, or even better, embed some of these competencies throughout the entire curriculum. So when you talk about families, you include military families. When you talk about culture, you talk about military culture. When you talk about, systems, you talk about navigating the VA or military systems of care. So I'm hoping that all schools of social work will recognize that they need to include in their curriculum some conversation, and they can surely use the guidebook to help infuse these competencies and outcomes within all of the curriculum, as they do for other populations, African American, Hispanic, LBGT, etc. I mean, this is just another population that we need to continue to talk about. So there are some schools that have said, hey, look, we don't want anything to do with this. Okay, I get it. They can't seem to separate perhaps war from the individuals and families who are affected or impacted by military service. That's fine. But there are many schools who have reached out to us and have attended many conference sessions where they're very interested in developing a course or a concentration like we have here at USC. And the courses that we've come up with at USC may not be the right ones or the right sequence of those, but we're studying them and we're continuing to look at them and get feedback. But based on what the work that CSWE and the steering group did, we feel that these 4 courses kind of capture the competencies in a manner that someone walks away feeling capable, competent, has the knowledge, and has an opportunity to have practiced these skills. So,
yep. And what are those 4 courses?
Yeah, the 4 courses in our school are, one is military culture, which is just a 1-credit course, but it's 15 hours of really understanding military culture. Many of the things that I highlighted for you, from basic things like what is Department of Defense, what are the different services, what are the different jobs, all the way to confidentiality and how do you manage that. So that's like the core course. Everyone in this concentration has to take that military cultures course, and then of course they can take 2 of the next 3 classes depending on what their focus is, if it's clinical, if it's health, if it's child and family. So they'll take 2 of these 3 courses I'm about to mention. The second course that we feel is important is clinical practice with service members and veterans. So the idea of this course is to really understand the development, the military life course. What's military life about? How does that match up with your development, your normal life development? Looking at those strengths, some of the what do you call them, risk factors, protective factors as well, looking at mental health, talking about combat stress reactions, talking about PTSD and TBI, and then really teaching them about the evidence-based interventions. This course, we try to focus it on training more of the clinical practice. So we really try to drill down in those evidence-based interventions in a way that the student walks away with a set of skills that they can begin to work with perhaps in their internship. The other course is the Military Impacted by Military Service course, Understanding and Intervening with Military Families. And families meaning all families, mother, father, sister, brother, husband, wife, daughter, son. So we're trying to be extremely inclusive there. We're going to talk about family resilience. We're going to talk about military family violence. I know one of your questions that came in was about military family violence, intimate partner violence, and so we will cover that. We'll talk about it. Again, there's so much to cover. I don't want this to be a survey course where we're covering everything, but there's so much to cover that sometimes that's what happens, and that's what I'm looking at adjusting with these courses, is to get away from talking about everything, but talking about key areas and talking about them more in depth. But again, it's talking here about evidence-based intervention models, cognitive behavioral therapies, emotionally focused couples therapy work, etc. And then the last course is one we call Health Challenges for Wounded Warriors and Their Caregivers. And we really felt this course was necessary because of the number of men and women who are coming back with wounds and lifelong injuries and amputations and loss of sight, etc., but also the impact that has on their caregivers, not only a spouse, but a family member, or just looking at caregivers and even therapists and looking at secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, etc. So we felt it was important to talk about these issues of health and illness and disability, but also for students to walk away with a good understanding of how these systems of care within the DOD and the VA are servicing these veterans and caring for them, and talk about policy issues in all of our courses about how to change policy and affect policy. So we think these are the courses that one should have in a concentration, but we could be way off. But we're studying them. We're definitely getting feedback, and we've adjusted over the last couple of years each of the courses, and we're continuing to adjust. But they're all written with outcomes in mind from the CSWE guidebook on military social work. But the key piece here, as we know, is a signature pedagogy for social work, is the field placement. And that is the critical piece. The field placement is a requirement in your second year that you have to have your internship in a VA, a vet center, or a veteran service organization in the community. But you have to work with veterans, either in a macro or micro practice, but you're definitely going to have to work with veterans. So we believe that is what sends this home. And we went from 14 students in this concentration 2 years ago to 80 this year. We have 200 who have signed up for next year. It's just taken off. We have over 1,100 students in our program on ground. Of course, we just started a virtual academic program, web-based, and it looks like about 20% of those students in the MSW program are interested in this concentration. So it's definitely growing. And I think one has to do with just people who have a desire to give back, but it's also highly marketable specialization right now. The Department of Defense is looking for folks, the VA, contracting organizations. There are a number of nonprofits that are springing up all over our community. We have over 60 veteran service type organizations within the LA, San Diego County area. So there's a lot of opportunities for social workers to work with veterans and military families, and also do macro work as the organizations grow and develop in advocacy and policy. And so I think there's an attraction for many reasons for this concentration.
So one question, we have folks from all over the world that listen to this podcast. Can anybody take the intro course through USC? You said there's a web-based component. Can somebody sign up for that if they're in a school of social work that's not USC or even not in the United States?
Well, yes, they can always do that, and it would be pretty expensive to take the one credit course as a degree course. But what we're doing now is we're taking the material, we're actually converting it to certificates, continuing education units, and we're going to have it in a highly interactive web-based format. So yes, someone who's overseas who wanted to know about military culture, but in June we'll have it up where they'll be able to go online, pay a couple $100 and get this course. And if you wanted to get a certificate, you'd have to take again 40 hours. So
that sounds like an amazing opportunity for social workers all over the United States and even the world to have access to that type of specific training in military culture, working with vets, their families, injuries, all that sort of stuff. That must be a huge undertaking for you guys. To not only do the CSWE standards for your own students, but also thinking about it in terms of certificate programs that people can take online.
Absolutely, it is, and that's why we have a center here, and that's what my center is designed to do. It is really to be the leader in terms of education and training, research in this specific area, using research to inform curriculum and training. We've advanced some technologies. When the person asked a question about, has this war advanced the awareness and knowledge and treatment for PTSD? I mean, we're actually are developing a virtual patient, a veteran virtual patient. So when we talk about innovative technologies, that's part of it, is to use a virtual patient so that our students will meet the virtual soldier before they meet the very first live veteran. And so technologies are growing, and that's part of our center and our development here at USC, is to develop technologies that can advance the practice skills of clinicians and students alike.
I was at the Council on Social Work Education reception where USC unveiled this, and it was unbelievable seeing those flat screen TVs where you could ask questions of this virtual reality client and have them respond. It was amazing.
Well, it is amazing, and I'm very proud to be a part of this development. And it's in the early stages, but what makes this unique is this is the first time we'll have a standardized patient in social work or even behavioral health. I presented at an Institute of Medicine's panel about quality assurance, and I had mentioned the virtual patient, and many folks became very interested in many applications. If you were to let your mind wander and get creative, there are many things that this virtual patient can do for our profession. We can have a virtual patient for almost any client we want. We can have a virtual patient that helps our students learn about a suicidal patient and how to interact. I mean, just basic stuff to advanced stuff like measuring the treatment fidelity of cognitive behavioral therapy of this clinician. So does this clinician really know how to do CBT according to the manualized treatment approach? We can maybe eventually down the road use it to license people. So we can just let our minds wander and get creative with this virtual patient. Has a lot of application. Now, there are a lot of naysayers out there who want to criticize it, and I would say to them, it is new, it is a little intimidating and scary, but it's no way is this replacing a real client. We're just saying that this is a opportunity for students to interact with a standardized patient before they ever see their very first patient. And we all remember what it was like the first time we had a suicidal patient, or the first time we had a resistant patient, or the first time we had an angry patient.
Or an angry, suicidal, resistant patient.
Exactly. And so here is an opportunity for your students to really get that experience. Or something as simple as, what is your first 5 minutes like with this veteran virtual patient? Practice. And it is just an amazing training opportunity. And we're going to be studying it and looking at the immersibility and believability of this virtual patient so that we can make it better. And we have one of our partners is the Institute for Creative Technologies here at USC. And they're well known for the work with virtual patients, virtual reality. and immersive kind of technology. So we're very fortunate to have a partner in our research and our development like ICT. So yes, I'm very excited. So a lot of the work that we're doing at the school is out of the center, and so we feel very fortunate to have the infrastructure and the expertise to move our agenda, and that is to make uh, this area of behavioral health care for veterans and military families a priority, and we've received a lot of national attention for it. And I think it's good, not for us. I mean, yeah, I guess it's good for us, but it's really good for the profession. I mean, who would have ever thought that we'd have stuff about veterans at CSWE or at SWE? It's just this is a movement that's happening, and I'm glad to see it. I'm glad to see that we're focused and interested in competence, and that we're interested in making sure that we're addressing the unique needs of this population. And we are still talking about World War II. We're still talking about Vietnam. We're going to talk about this population, this war, Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom, for the next 20 and 30 years. Some families in the military have never seen a peacetime military. Their kids maybe were 3 years old, are now 13 years old. One spouse stood up at a conference and said, "Look, Admiral Mullen, I love all this prevention and early intervention stuff, but look, our family has been at war for 10 years. We're past that." And so we need to understand that this is going to continue to have long-lasting effects on our families and our communities for many, many years to come. I mean, we're now engaged in Libya. We just need to be aware that these men and women coming back to our communities may have unique circumstances that we need to be able to take care of. And I think that's my passion and motivation for the work we're doing here at USC, and my desire to make sure that others understand it and get it. Because if you don't get it as a veteran and we don't connect, I'm not coming back. If I don't come back, my problem gets worse. And when it gets worse, it affects many people. It affects the community. And so it behooves all of us to try to know and to be as competent as we can if we're going to care for this population. And if you don't want to care for this population, then I would say, just say so. You know, we all know in social work, if you don't want to work with a sex offender, you just don't work with sex offenders. If you don't want to work with veterans and military families, then don't. But if you do, or if you notice that they're coming into your agency more often, then maybe you need to spin them up and get some training in that organization for your providers. And I think social work as a profession needs to step up and get more involved in research in this area. If you look at the research that's done in this area, it's done by psychology and psychiatry. And frankly, it drives me nuts. Where's social work? And so I'm appealing to all of you to consider doing research with veterans and military families from our perspective, the family perspective, the systems perspective, the person in the environment perspective, because that's what we can offer. And I believe that we are the primary providers for this population. I know in the military we have more social workers than any other provider in behavioral health. In DOD we have more providers, mental health providers, and so social workers provide more mental health care in the VA than any of the other profession. We're a leader, but yet we're invisible when it comes to research. So I'm asking all of us to think about that and to really consider this as an area of viable research.
If there are social workers out there right now, maybe master's level, maybe even bachelor's level, and they are getting inspired listening to you talk about wanting to understand how to best serve, either community dwelling vets or anybody associated with the military, can they come to USC and learn how to become a researcher? I mean, is that something that you guys can offer?
Well, right now in the PhD program is very selective, of course, but we're looking at bringing in a senior researcher with a military social work research background, and so that PhD students come into our program can make this a career for themselves and have the mentorship here within USC. So right now we're focused on recruiting some top researchers in this area who've researched in NIMH, DOD, VA, so that we will have mentors and guides to educate and train the next generation of social work researchers in the area of veterans and military families. So, yes, we're moving in that direction. Um, Surely, if an MSW student right now, like I said, we have about 200 who have identified themselves as military social work concentration students. We have a couple of them who are working in my center right now and are assisting with research projects. So this is the beginning for them, but they're showing an interest. And I could tell you, having presented at many conferences, I'm always asked about that, and we would hope that we can grow this area here at USC as well.
Another question that we didn't specifically answer, and maybe it's because it's not answerable, but what types of jobs do military social workers do?
Yeah, absolutely. Where do they get employment? And every agency in the community that will have a veteran or a family member and knock on their door. It's just that some agencies and some communities will see more, and that's all they may see. For example, the U.S. Vets Inc. here focuses on homeless veterans, and so that's their whole program, and they're national, and they focus on nothing but homeless veterans. So we have a lot of students who have their internships there and will get placed there. We have New Directions focuses on substance abuse and veterans and homeless veterans. So it just depends on what agency you're involved with. We have family courts now, so you may work in the family courts that focuses on veteran courts. So you may have an interest in legal, guardian, or advocacy. We have now noticed that the Department of Children and Families is seeing a need to better understand military families as they now interact more often. The Department of Mental Health in Los Angeles has a whole separate section for veterans, so there's employment there. So people are starting to identify sections or areas where they need to beef up staff in various organizations that maybe traditionally haven't focused on this as a separate population. Of course, you got the entire VA spectrum of employment, Veterans Affairs, hospitals, outpatient clinics, community-based clinics. You have vet clinics or vet centers, or more of drop-in centers are now springing up all over the United States. They have navigator programs where helping veterans navigate services. They have recovery care coordinators that are social work positions at the undergraduate level who will work with a veteran from the time they return with an injury throughout their entire life. There'll be a case manager involved in their care. On and on and on. Schools, we have 143 schools that we're working with in San Diego. Ron Astor is the PI for the research project, but we're really building capacity in those schools. And so now we're focusing on military impacted schools, and we have 40 social workers in those schools who have an understanding of military culture and military challenges and the impact on families. Just every agency you can imagine that is near a military facility or has a community, a large number of veterans in their community, will start seeing a special division or section within that agency to care for veterans. Not to mention all the contracting contracting companies that work for the Department of Defense. For example, we have social workers overseas who work with family violence. And so all the family advocacy treatment managers are social workers, and they're hired through a contractor, Department of Defense contractor. So you can go work as a military social worker overseas in the family advocacy program. So I could go on, but there are many, many opportunities,
What are some resources that are out there for folks who are listening that want to know more about military social work?
Of course, the Council on Social Work Education, this handbook. You can find this book online at CSWE. I like the guidebook, not just the guide curriculum, but boy, when you hand it to the student and you tell them, hey, look, when you finish your MSW degree, you should at least have knowledge and practice in these areas. And so field instructors and agencies should look at this document and say, yeah, we can help advance the practice skills for this student in these areas. Oh, yeah, we can do that. Or, you know what? No, we can't. And so I think it's a tool for the student, the professor, and the field. Okay, so that's the CSWE document. Another document I was just reading last night, it's called An Achievable Vision, a report of the Department of Defense Task Force on Mental Health. I just like the report. It really gives you a sense of what's needed within the military. And so it talks about the lack of providers who are educated in evidence-based intervention, the need to keep providers who have military culture awareness. It talks about confidentiality. It talks about anything and everything that an individual would want to know about the challenges faced by men and women in uniform and their families. So I think that's a great tool, a great document to have. I'm looking at some documents here. I was just looking at the Institute of Medicine's 2010 report last night. I think it's a excellent report, and I just sent it to all my staff, asking them to again refresh themselves on these recommendations that the Institute of Medicine is pushing out. And so you would get a good sense of what's happening, what are the challenges, what's the community need to do, what are researchers need to do, what do we need to do to train, what do we need to train them on. It's a very, very nice, well done report. And a book that I read, I think is a decent read, is the book by Hall, 2008, called Counseling Military Families. There's a perspective of a civilian provider. Then of course you got Hogue and Castro. Their 2004 article, which is the article that really kind of got everybody aware of what was going on. It's called Combat Duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, Mental Health Problems and Barriers to Care. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't give you Tonelli and Jaycock's Invisible Wounds, 2008. That was the seminal work. So I hope that's enough. We can go on with more, but I think those three reports are huge. Invisible Wounds, DoD Task Force report, and the Institute of Medicine's report are just the foundation pieces that you would need to read about if you really wanted to study this and learn more about it.
Yeah, and we'll put the links to those on the Social Work Podcast website. Anthony, I want to thank you so much for spending the time with us today and talking with us about military social work.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was my pleasure, and again, this is my commitment. So anything I can do to help now and in the future, please don't hesitate to call upon me.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.